All right, so you want to talk Nosferatu symbolism. Specifically, you sent over this video essay, right?
Yeah, yeah. This one really digs into all the psychological stuff, which I thought was super interesting.
Okay, cool, cool. Buckle up then. I mean, we're talking vampires, Andy, Victorian era anxieties. Things are going to get kind of dark.
For sure, for sure. And the person who made the essay, I mean, they're a doctor of clinical psychology. They write horror, and they're Romanian. So, like, instant credibility right there.
Right. I mean, that background is like tailor-made for this kind of deep dive.
Totally. And the thing is, it's not just like a surface level analysis of the film.
Mm-hmm.
They're using the vampire, like Nosferatu, as a way to understand how we deal with fear, how those fears change over time. But before we go too deep into all that, can we just back up for a sec? Like, how does this Nosferatu movie connect back to Dracula?
Yeah, good point. Gotta set the stage. Okay,
Was actually a remake of that 1922 Nosferatu film, which itself was already trying to adapt Dracula without getting sued for copyright. So it's like a copy of a copy.
a copy of a copy. I like that. But with each version, the vampire kind of morphs into something new, right? Takes on new meanings.
Exactly. And the essayist is really into how Eggers, the director, makes this new version his own. They keep praising him for being so historically accurate.
Especially all the Romanian stuff, right? I mean, filming at Corvinsaler Castle, Vlad the Impaler's old stomping ground.
Oh, yeah, for sure. But it goes even deeper than that. Like, did you catch the thing about the word Nesufferit?
Wait, the insufferable thing.
Exactly. Apparently, a lot of Romanian names end with U. So that detail, it's like another way Eggers is grounding this whole fantastical vampire story in real history, real culture.
Wow, that attention to detail. I love it.
Right. And the essayist even contrasted that with how another horror film, I think it was The Nun, just totally messed up the whole Romanian representation thing. Which, it's a funny little aside, but it shows you how much Eggers cares about getting it right.
Totally. Okay, so we've got a historically accurate vampire film. Check. But why is the symbolism so important? Why should anyone care?
Okay, so here's the thing. The essayist makes this point that the vampire, like as a monster figure, right? It's like a mirror. It reflects whatever anxieties people have at the time the story is being told. So like way back with Bram Stoker's Dracula, it was all about sexual anxieties, fear of foreigners, that kind of stuff.
Right, Dracula, the original bad boy.
Yeah, totally. And what about later interpretations? Like, what about Coppola's version?
Okay, yeah, Coppola's Dracula definitely leaned into the whole seductive vampire thing, right? Like the danger within relationships, all that.
Exactly. But in Eggers' Nosferatu, it's different. The essayist says it's more about death itself and how we try to deal with it, how we grapple with it. But it's not just death in general. They tie it specifically to Ellen, the female lead, and her struggles with melancholia.
Hold up, melancholia. Is that just a fancy old-timey word for depression?
Pretty much, yeah. And the essayist points out how the film shows how people in the Victorian era dealt with women's mental health. And let's just say it wasn't great. Like they tried using corsets as a treatment, or they just completely dismissed women's experiences altogether.
It's like they couldn't even fathom that women could have these complex internal struggles, you know?
And then there's this fascinating connection the essayist makes between Ellen's seizures and this thing called hysteria, which was this catch-all diagnosis for women back
Well,
then.
yeah, wasn't that basically any time a woman showed too much emotion or something?
Well, it was definitely more complicated than that, but it did get used to dismiss women's feelings and experiences. And get this, the essayist links this to modern ideas about histrionic personality disorder.
Hold on, really? How does that work?
So, histrionic personality disorder is marked by this excessive need for attention and emotional outbursts. And sometimes, people with this disorder can even have things like pseudo-seizures. Basically, seizures that aren't caused by any actual physical problem in the brain. The essayist suggests that Ellen's seizures might be linked to this, connecting it back to that Victorian idea of hysteria.
Whoa, that's a really interesting take. It adds a whole new layer to her character.
Right, and it makes you think about how much our understanding of mental health has changed, but also how some things, like the tendency to dismiss women's experiences, might still be present in different forms today.
Okay, so we've talked about Ellen's struggles, but how does Nosferatu himself, the vampire, fit into all of this? Where does he come in?
Ooh, that's where it gets really creepy.
Mm.
There's this line in the film where Ellen says, "He's my melancholy." And the essayist interprets that as Nosferatu literally being the embodiment of Ellen's depression.
So it's not just a monster, it's like a physical manifestation of her internal turmoil. That's messed up, man.
Exactly. And this whole idea of something hidden and dark taking over, well, it ties into another concept the essayist brings up, The Jungian idea of the shadow self.
Okay, gotta love some good old Jungian psychology. Can you break that down for our listener?
So imagine this. You have this hidden part of your personality where you shove all the thoughts and feelings about yourself that you don't like, the stuff that makes you feel ashamed, the stuff that scares you. That's your shadow self, according to Jung.
Deep stuff, man. Deep stuff. And are they saying Nosferatu represents that shadow self for both Ellen and Thomas?
Yeah, that's the idea. For Thomas, his shadow self is all about financial insecurity, that feeling of needing to close a deal no matter what, even if it's super risky.
Right, right. We see that play out throughout the whole film.
And for Ellen, the essayist suggests her shadow self is connected to her loneliness, her difficult childhood, all those experiences she might be trying to bury.
Wow. So Nosferatu is like this predator feeding on their deepest vulnerabilities, their darkest secrets.
Exactly. And that scene where Thomas goes down into the crypt to confront Nosferatu, the essayist makes a point about that too.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. What's the deal with the crypt?
Well, they argue that the crypt symbolizes the unconscious mind, the place where we try to keep all those shadow self tendencies hidden away. So when Thomas goes down there, it's like he's literally facing his darkest fears, going deep into the unknown parts of himself.
Whoa, that's powerful imagery. I mean, if you think about it, we all have these shadow selves lurking within us, right? Just waiting to be unleashed.
I think that's what the film is trying to get at. It's asking us to confront those dark parts of ourselves, to understand them, rather than letting them control us.
Okay, that's intense. And speaking of intense, what about the ending? How does the essayist interpret what happens to Ellen?
Well, they offer two really interesting interpretations. One is that Ellen giving in to Nosferatu, their marriage, as the film presents it, is actually a metaphor for suicide.
Whoa, okay. Yeah, that's definitely dark. But it kind of makes sense, right? Like, she's completely overwhelmed by her depression, by that darkness within her. It's like giving in to despair.
Right, it's tragic for sure. But the essayist also offers another reading, a more empowering one.
Ooh, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about that one.
Okay, so what if, by choosing to marry her shadow self, Ellen isn't giving in, but actually confronting it head on? Like, what if it's about integrating those dark parts of herself, gaining some control over them instead of letting them control her?
Okay, I see what you mean. It's like she's choosing to face her demons, even if it means making a deal with the devil, so to speak.
Exactly. And that idea ties back to that whole Jungian thing we were talking about, the importance of facing your shadow self, of integrating it into your whole self rather than trying to deny it.
So, two very different ways of looking at the same event. It really makes you think about the nature of depression and whether we can ever truly escape those darker parts of ourselves.
And it speaks to the power of symbolism, how one image can hold so many different meanings, prompting us to question our assumptions and look at things in new ways.
All right, before we wrap up this first part of our deep dive, I got to ask about those occult elements the essayist pointed out. It seems like Eggers snuck in a lot of weird little details, like Count Orlok speaking Latin, those strange runes, all that.
Oh yeah, I was hoping we'd get to that. The essayists couldn't even decipher those runes. They thought maybe they were totally made up, just to add to the whole mysterious vibe.
hmm
But their presence alone definitely points to this fascination with the occult, with hidden knowledge and ancient powers.
Totally. And then there's that seven-pointed star, which, big deal in occult circles, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's often associated with things like esoteric knowledge, alchemy, all that mystical stuff. It's seen as this bridge between worlds, connecting the earthly and the supernatural.
Which is interesting because Ellen has that whole second sight thing going on where she can basically like astrally project.
Exactly. And Professor von Franz, the one who's into alchemy and all that, he seems to understand that side of Ellen too. Like, he gets that she's not just a normal person. She's connected to something bigger, something more powerful.
He even says something like her soul is elsewhere, meaning she's not bound by the same rules as everyone else. So does all this occult stuff tie back to the shadow self idea in any way? Or is it just there to make the movie creepier?
I think it definitely adds another layer to that exploration of the shadow self. Like, the shadow self isn't just psychological, it's also connected to these darker, more mystical forces that might be lurking within us, things we can't fully understand or control.
Okay, so to recap, we've gone from the historical accuracy of Nosferatu to the psychological depths of the vampire as a symbol of our deepest fears. We talked about death, depression, the shadow self, and even dipped our toes into some spooky occult stuff.
And it's all woven together so brilliantly by Eggers. He's created a film that's not just scary, it's like intellectually stimulating. It makes you think.
Totally. The essayist even brings up this thought about how Eggers' wife is a psychologist, and they're like, I wonder if she had any influence on the film's exploration of mental health. What do you think about that?
It's such an interesting question, right? It makes you think about collaboration, how different perspectives can come together to create something really special. Like maybe it was the merging of Egger's vision with his wife's insights that gave Nosferatu its unique power.
Ooh, I like that. I like that a lot. But before we let you go, there's one last thing we got to consider.
Yeah, that whole idea that Egger's wife, the psychologist, maybe she had some input. Like, what do you think, listener? Does knowing that add anything to how you interpret the film?
Hmm. It's definitely something to consider. But for now, I want to circle back to something we were talking about before, that whole shadow self concept.
Right, right. So the essayists, they basically say that Nosferatu represents that hidden, darker side of both Ellen and D. Thomas.
Okay, and just to remind everyone, the shadow self is like all the stuff we try to bury deep down, the parts of ourselves we're ashamed of or scared of.
Exactly, exactly. And the essayists suggest that both Ellen and Thomas, they have these kind of like hidden aspects that Nosferatu feeds on.
Right. Like with Thomas, it's all that financial insecurity, that drive to close deals no matter what, even if it means like putting himself in danger. It's almost like he's willing to sacrifice anything for success.
Totally. And that actually ties into a lot of the anxieties people had back then in the Victorian era,
Hmm.
the whole rise of capitalism, the pressure to succeed, all that. It's like Nosferatu represents those societal fears as much as he does Thomas's personal ones.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about Ellen then? What's her shadow self all about?
Well, for her, the essayist thinks it's rooted in her loneliness, her difficult childhood. We get these little glimpses throughout the film, like hints that she's been through some tough stuff.
Right, right. And I think that makes Nosferatu's appeal to her even more tragic, you know? It's like he's offering her an escape from all that pain, even if it ultimately leads to her destruction.
Exactly. It's like he's offering a solution that's actually like way worse than the problem.
Yeah, totally. And it makes that line she says, "He is my melancholy," even more chilling. It's like she knows, on some level, that Nosferatu represents this dark part of herself she can't escape.
Right, like she's aware of that connection, but she can't break free from it.
And what about that scene where Thomas goes down into the crypt to confront Nosferatu? The essayist said something about that too, right?
Yes. They talk about how the crypt symbolizes the unconscious mind. That place where we try to keep all our shadow self stuff hidden away.
Okay, I'm following you.
So when Thomas goes down there, it's like he's literally facing his darkest fears. He's going into this unknown, hidden part of himself.
It's like a visual representation of that whole confronting your demons thing. Pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah. And if you think about it, we all have those shadow selves lurking somewhere inside us, right? The question is, what are we going to do about them?
I mean, ignore them. Try to fight them.
That's where the ending of the film gets really interesting, because that's where the essayist offers these two totally different interpretations.
Right, the suicide reading, which is definitely supported by how dark and, kind of hopeless the whole movie feels. But then there's that other reading too, the more empowering one.
Yeah. So the question is Ellen giving into her despair? Or is she actually taking control, choosing to face her shadow self head on?
Okay, so on the one hand, we have the giving in interpretation, which is pretty straightforward. But how does the essayist justify that whole taking control thing?
Yeah.
Seems kind of counterintuitive, right? Like, how can embracing something so dark be empowering?
Well, the idea is that by acknowledging those dark parts of ourselves, we take away their power, right? Like, what if, by facing those shadows head on, we can actually integrate them into our whole selves and become, like, more complete, more whole?
Okay, I think I see what you're saying. Instead of pretending those dark parts don't exist, we learn to live with them, understand them, maybe even like use them for good.
Yeah, exactly. And that idea of integration, of wholeness, is actually a big deal in Jungian psychology. It's not about getting rid of the darkness, but about finding a balance.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot more sense. It's a much more nuanced take on that whole good versus evil thing you usually see in vampire stories. But this is where I think that whole historical context comes back in, the Victorian era stuff.
Oh, how so?
Well, think about all the repression back then, especially for women, all these strict societal rules and expectations. So maybe, in a way, Ellen choosing to embrace her shadow self is like this act of rebellion. It's like she's saying, I'm not going to hide who I am anymore. I'm going to own it, even the dark parts.
Wow, that's a really interesting point. Like maybe that kind of rebellion, that refusal to conform, was even more radical back then, given how rigid society was.
Right. It adds a whole new dimension to the film. It's not just about individual psychology, it's also about these larger social forces and how we try to break free from them.
It totally does. It shows how Eggers can weave together those personal and societal themes in such a thought-provoking way. He doesn't shy away from the darkness, but he also gives us these glimpses of, hope, of possibility.
Absolutely. Okay, so before we go too far down the rabbit hole here, I want to come back to some of those little details the essayist brought up, like all that occult symbolism that Eggers sprinkles throughout the film, the Latin chanting, those mysterious runes, the seven-pointed star, all that.
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's like he's creating this whole other layer of meaning that runs alongside the psychological stuff.
And that's what makes this film so awesome, right? There's just so much going on. It's like every little detail has a purpose. So let's break it down a little bit. First off, what's the deal with Count Orlok speaking Latin? Is it just to sound extra creepy?
Well, I mean, it definitely works on that level, right?
Hmm.
But I think it also points to this idea of ancient knowledge, of hidden powers that are beyond our understanding. Latin was like the language of scholars, of alchemists. So it links Nosferatu to that world of like mystery and the occult.
And those runes, the essayists couldn't even figure out what they meant.
I know, right?
What?
They even thought maybe Eggers just made them up. But I think even if they are made up, it still adds to that sense of mystery. Like, these are secret codes, languages that only certain people can understand.
Right, right. And that makes Nosferatu seem even older, even more powerful, like he's connected to these forces we can't even comprehend.
Exactly. And then you have that seven-pointed star, which, as the essayist points out, is a huge deal in occult symbolism.
So what's the significance there?
Well, the seven-pointed star is often associated with, like, esoteric knowledge, with bridging the gap between the earthly realm and the spiritual realm. It's a symbol of transcendence, of going beyond our normal senses, our normal understanding of the world.
Hmm. Interesting. And that actually connects to Ellen, too, right? I mean, she has that whole second sight thing going on, like she can astrally project and see things other people can't.
Oh, totally. It's like the seven-pointed star is foreshadowing her abilities, her connection to this other realm of existence.
And Professor von Franz, the alchemist dude, he seems to understand that side of Ellen, too, right? Like, he recognizes that she's not just some ordinary girl.
Oh, yeah. He definitely gets it.
Mm.
He sees her as someone who is in touch with those hidden forces, someone who's not bound by the normal rules.
So it seems like all this occult symbolism, it's not just there for spooky atmosphere, it's actually adding depth to the film's exploration of the shadow self. All those things lurking beneath the surface of our everyday lives.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's like Eggers is giving us a visual language for these complex, abstract concepts, letting us experience them on this intuitive level.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And it makes me want to go back and rewatch the film, like right now. I feel like I'd notice so much more now that we've talked about all this stuff.
I think that's the mark of a truly great film.
Yeah.
The kind that keeps revealing new layers of meaning every time you watch it.
Okay, so before we go totally off the rails here, talking about vampire symbolism forever, I do want to circle back to something the essayist mentioned. Remember how they pointed out that Eggers' wife is a psychologist?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And they wondered if that might have influenced the firm's exploration of mental health.
Right. And it just made me think, what a cool example of collaboration, of how different perspectives can come together to create something so unique. Like maybe it was that merging of Eggers' artistic vision with his wife's insights that made Nosferatu so effective.
Yeah, for sure. It's like he's tapping into something deeper than just scares. He's touching on those anxieties we all have, those fears that are, like, universal.
And that brings us back to one of the main themes of this whole deep dive, doesn't it? The idea that the vampire, this classic monster figure, it's actually a reflection of our own anxieties, the stuff we try to hide from, but that ultimately shapes who we are.
Absolutely. And with that in mind, I think it's time to hear from you, listener.
Yeah. We've been talking a lot about the essayist's ideas, but now we want to know, what about you? What stood out to you? What parts of the film or the symbolism really stuck with you?
Yeah, what resonated with you? Did any of those interpretations, like the stuff about the shadow self or the occult, did any of that surprise you?
And most importantly, how do you make sense of Nosferatu? What does the film say to you?
We'd love to hear your thoughts. I mean, that's what makes these deep dives so much fun. Art's all about sparking a conversation.
Mm.
And through those conversations, we can understand ourselves and the world a little bit better.
Yeah, for sure. But before we totally wrap things up, I do want to circle back to something we touched on earlier, that whole Christmas time setting. Remember how the essayist made a big deal about that?
Oh, yeah, totally. It seemed kind of weird at first, right? Setting a vampire movie during a holiday that's supposed to be all about, like, light and hope.
Right. But when you think about it symbolically, it adds a whole other dimension to the story.
Yeah, like Nosferatu becomes this dark opposite to the whole Christmas message. He's like the embodiment of temptation and despair lurking in the shadows while everyone else is, celebrating and being joyful.
Yeah, exactly. And it makes you wonder, can we ever really escape the darkness, even during the most hopeful time of year? Or is it always there, just below the surface, waiting to, like, creep back in?
Ooh, that's a creepy thought. And it makes that whole Antichrist comparison the essayist brought up even more intense. It's like Nosferatu is this like satanic figure tempting people away from goodness and into, the abyss.
Yeah, totally. And that temptation is especially strong for characters like Ellen, who are already dealing with so much pain and inner turmoil. It's like Nosferatu preys on their vulnerability, offering them a way out that's actually way worse than the problems they're already facing.
Right, like a classic deal with the devil kind of thing, trading your soul for temporary relief.
But it's not just Ellen's soul that's at stake here. It's the whole community that's threatened by Nosferatu's presence. He's like this infectious disease, spreading darkness wherever he goes.
Yeah. And that ties back into what we were talking about earlier, that idea that the vampire, in a way, represents those dark forces that are
Right.
inside all of us. Like, he's a manifestation of our collective shadow, the stuff we try to repress, but that ultimately has the power to destroy us.
It's heavy stuff. And the film doesn't really give us any easy answers, does it? It's more about raising questions, challenging us to confront our own darkness and figure out how to, like, deal with it.
Yeah, I think that's what makes it so thought-provoking. It's not just entertainment. It's like a challenge. It's asking us to look inward and examine those parts of ourselves we'd rather not think about.
And that's what makes this deep dive so rewarding, right? We've gone beyond just summarizing the essay, we've really engaged with it. We've
Mm.
challenged those ideas and come up with our own interpretations.
And hopefully you, the listener, have done the same. We've given you a lot to think about, and we encourage you to keep exploring these themes. Watch the film again. Think about it from different angles and come to your own conclusions.
Because at the end of the day, that's what art is all about. It's about sparking conversations, challenging our assumptions, and helping us see the world in new ways.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Nosferatu. We hope you've enjoyed the journey, and we can't wait to see where your own explorations take you.